Welcome everybody to Cali School Arts and Heritage Center. I think most of you have been here before, maybe a few new faces, but we always have wonderful things going on. Oh, you can't hear?
It's not on, Susan.
It's not on.
It's on, it just needs more volume.
Better now? No, no? I am yelling. Ah, there. That's echoing, right? Okay. Good. All right. Once again, welcome to Cali School Arts and Heritage Center. We have all kinds of wonderful activities going on here all the time. I'll tell you some of the ones coming up, but you should always check out our website and Facebook page. Let's see, May 2nd and 3rd, we're having a plant sale here, so you can come get all your good stuff for your garden. On May 3rd, right after the plant sale, we're having a concert with Flatbridge. On May 6th is the first farmers market of the year, and that will be every Wednesday from 3:30 to 5:30 up until frost. On May the 15th,
Yes.
the Arts and Nature Symposium will be here. On May 21st, there'll be a contra dance. And all the time, our wonderful resident artists are teaching classes in painting, pottery, fiber arts, yoga, dance, basket making. So join in those. There's always something good happening. There's the open mic the second Friday of every month. So that's another fun thing. This is part of the speaker series called Where We Live, History, Nature, and Culture. And every month on the third Monday, we have a program on history, nature, or culture. And it ranges pretty far. Next month, our program will be on Cali Valley Minerals and Mining. The director of the Gem Museum in Franklin will be doing a program on mining in the Cali Valley, on our history and that. As you know, we had rubies, we had all kinds of stuff. So that will be a fun program. I have two requests. First, it is on your way out, you give us a donation. That helps us keep these things going. Most of our programs are free. And also, we always need volunteers. It would be great to have a volunteer help with setup for this event every month. We can use help in the coffee shop. We can use help in the office. This Saturday, we're having the Smoky Mountain Relay, which is the race that's run all around the rural roads here. And we're serving breakfast to several hundred people. And we could certainly use a little help. Yeah? 575 people we're serving breakfast to. So we could use help with that for sure. Just let Susan know if you want to help with that. Okay. Tonight we're really excited to have with us Dr. Julie Reed. She's a citizen of the Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma. And of course we've had many programs here from the Eastern Band, but this will be our first from the Oklahoma branch. So we appreciate you for that. She's talking about the Cherokee educational system. So often we hear about the education through the mission schools, the education that was pretty much imposed on the Cherokee people. And there was a lot going on beyond that. And so she's going to tell us about their traditional education with some emphasis on women in education. And Julie, I'll just let you take it from here. Thank you so much.
Well, it is a delight to be here because I actually spent the last 2 summers living upstairs in Rickman's store while I was doing field work with Brett Riggs and Jane Eastman and out at Watauga. So for the past couple of years, I've had a Mellon New Directions Award, which is part of the reason that I'm here right now, learning archaeology, specifically focusing on Southeastern archaeology and really wanting to dig into Cherokee archaeology and ancestral spaces that were connected to Cherokee people. So I've been hanging around here the last couple of summers. I bought a lot of vegetables from the farmer's market over the summer and have walked the path late at night out of the track, probably when I'm not supposed to be there, but to get some steps in at the end of the day. So I'm thrilled to be here. I want to thank you all for inviting me. Thanks to City Lights for doing the work of kind of setting up the books. And it's just this, I'm in my final couple weeks of being out here. I just made the move from Penn State University to the University of Tulsa and living out in Oklahoma. So it's been a kind of disjointed year, but it's been lovely being here at Western Carolina for the semester. And so I, again, am delighted to share my work with folks in the communities where I have taken inspiration and where I have learned and that inform the work that I do. So I suspect I'll probably learn a little more from some of you all tonight. So I do want to tell you a little bit about, this book is a really different book from my first book. My first book was on, actually I'll go ahead and maybe forward on the slide. My first book was called Serving the Nation, and it was on the development of Cherokee social welfare systems, particularly in the wake of removal and later the Civil War, and primarily focusing on Indian Territory. But I was really interested in kind of larger question of why move from a system that was rooted in matrilineal kinship systems, that was rooted in clan, that was rooted in matrilineality, that was rooted in these different ways of constructing how the responsibilities of care, medical treatment, social welfare more broadly, why move to these U.S. institution-based models? And of course, the story we often hear about the Cherokees and the 5 tribes more broadly is that they just did what the white people did. And so they were just starting institutions because that's what their white neighbors were doing and Cherokees were assimilative. And that seemed dissatisfying to me, that felt, okay, sure, but is that all that's happening? And so one of the questions that I wanted to look at is the degree to which these institutions actually mirrored what was happening in the larger United States and the ways that those institutions deviated or looked different, looked kind of Cherokee specific. And I'll just kind of tell you my major finding. There were basically 4 kind of institutions of social welfare that were developed. One was the Cherokee National Prison, which opened in 1875. One was the Cherokee Orphanage. There were a significant number of orphans after the Civil War in Indian Territory. And so the Cherokees opened an orphanage to serve Cherokee kids. There was also a facility for the disabled people and those suffering from mental illness. And then generally there were welfare payments that were made. There were widows' pensions, there were pensions for disabled people, there were war pensions, and also there was a use of the pensions that were happening in the larger United States that were distributed to Cherokee people who had served on behalf of the United States. And one of my major findings in that book was that not all the institutions were beloved in the same way. So if we were to look at a continuum, Cherokee people really didn't like the institution that served the disabled and the mentally ill. And part of that was that the institution slowly cut off access to the community. And so it wouldn't let family members come and visit. It wouldn't let people come and visit their friends. There was a kind of institutional inaccessibility and also a turn towards something that looked more like imprisonment than care. And so Cherokee people did not put their family members there over time. Not surprising, kind of went against the ethics and ethos of the community itself, that we are responsible for each other, and regardless of whether they're in an institution or not, that the community should still be able to commune with their neighbors and kin. The orphanage was the most beloved, and part of that was, number one, it never cut off the use of Cherokee language. And it started a couple years before Carlisle, so really stood at odds with what we hear about boarding schools in the United States more broadly. It was teaching Cherokee government side by side with U.S. government. So there were ways in which pieces of Cherokee culture were being embedded and were embraced at that particular institution. So all of this is to say, I thought I was going to write another institutional book when I wrote this book. I thought I was going to write a book about schools and think about missions and think about the Cherokee Public School Act of 1841, which universalized public education in the Cherokee Nation. And all of that changed when I was still a professor over at the University of Tennessee, and I was asked by some archaeologists working over there, alongside Beau Carroll, who some of you may or may not know. He is the interim TIPO officer down at the Eastern Band. At the time, he was a master's and then PhD student at the University of Tennessee. Jan Schimmick was involved in this project, and they said, we have some syllabary in some caves. And we would like you, as a historian, to kind of contextualize the towns and the areas where this syllabary is showing up. And I'm like, I can do that. I can look at documents. I can figure out what's going on in Cherokee history. But then they came to me again and said, well, do you want to go into the caves? And I said, absolutely. So here I find myself inside these caves back in 2016, really struggling with what I'm looking at. That there is syllabary in these caves, and Beau Carroll and this team that I've been a part of have written a couple articles on these caves. Beau Carroll's dissertation talks a bit about another cave that we have not written up more broadly, but is available through his dissertation. And this particular cave site that we're in, this is a kind of larger room, there is syllabary everywhere. And when I say everywhere, what I mean is there's a kind of panel on the wall off to the side where you can kind of see that flat surface, and if you look really closely you might be able to see some of the etching. It's also just a wall where people who've gone into that caves over time have put graffiti. So quite literally this syllabary is kind of buried in plain sight, that there's so much graffiti on that wall that you could look right past the syllabary itself because it's underneath this more recent graffiti. There's also syllabary throughout this cave if you're down on your hands and knees, and there's single syllables all over the place. There's also syllabary on the ceiling of this cave that our particular kind of expert caver could not get to. He would have either had to kind of rig up a pretty elaborate roping system, or he would have had to have built something to get to that ceiling. I should also add, this is about between 1.25 miles deep in the cave, so this is pitch black, there's no light. So obviously we're going in there with LED lights and very technologically sophisticated lights by today's standards, but anybody who was going into this cave in the 19th century was going in with river cane torches, or torches of some kind. And the people writing in this cave are not the same author. So the people writing the narrative on the wall are not the same people that are writing those individual syllables when you crawl. And it's not the same author as who's writing on the ceiling. And so you have kind of a multi-author document inside a cave, right? And really three-dimensional, because it's you've got to look to the side, you've got to look below, you've got to look up. And added to that, I should add that what's on the ceiling is not meant to be read by us. So if I look up at the ceiling, it's not meant to be read by me. It's meant to be read by someone or something looking down from above. So, I'm somebody who thinks a lot about documents, who thinks a lot about archives, who thinks a lot about classroom spaces, who thinks a lot about change over time as a historian, but I also, as a historian who privileges the kind of actions and activities of Native peoples and Native communities, is also interested in what continues. Not just what changes, but what continues. What gets protected and carried forward. And what was fascinating to me about this cave site is you have changes and continuities all happening at the exact same time. That Sequoia syllabary is brand new in this moment. It's a brand new technology. But the person who's writing on that ceiling is doing something very, very old with it. Versus the person that's writing on the wall is doing something very new. They're recording kind of an event that's just taken place. The person that's writing on that ceiling is talking to beings that live above. That is old. That's an old Cherokee cosmology. That's an old understanding of relationships in the world. And so then I'm left in this moment in all sorts of mind being blown, thinking, how can I write a book about classrooms if I'm not thinking about this classroom? If I'm not thinking about the learning that's taken place? And to further kind of drive that home for me was the fact that we have plenty of evidence in a cave like this and the other caves we've gone into that it wasn't just Cherokees in the 1820s going into this cave to write. There were Mississippian peoples going in there. We have carbon dating to show us that. There were Woodlands people going into this cave. So indigenous Southerners have been going into these caves for very long spans of time. So beyond just it being an important place to Cherokees, it's an important place to ancestral Cherokees, to older indigenous peoples living throughout the South. And if that doesn't demand kind of a longer chronology of thinking about educational practices, I don't know what does. And then if I'm thinking about the land itself, which I was not until I went into this cave, that I had to suddenly think about the fact that in this particular cave, there's stalactites and stalagmites that are thousands of years old. So the landscape itself demands that we think along longer chronologies. So what I originally thought was going to be a book about schools and started in the 19th century and talked about Sequoia, ended up going much further back in time. So this book, I wound up covering 400 years of Cherokee history by kind of taking a classroom at a given point in time and kind of thinking big about what is a classroom to Cherokee people 400 years ago? What is a classroom to Cherokee people 300 years ago, 250 years ago, 150 years ago? And what are the ways that those classrooms are both continuing to do some of the same things and are also doing some different things? So there's changes and continuities. And then another hiccup was that I took my daughter with me to these cave sites. And my daughter was 4 months old when I went back to get my PhD. The reality of that, I was a poor graduate student, as many of us are. There were times when my daughter accompanied me to things that I didn't always have a choice about that. That it wasn't like me being some kind of feminist and wanting my daughter to kind of get exposure to these things. It was just a kind of act of like, I don't have a sitter. I can't afford a sitter. I don't have a social welfare network to take my child in. This is just a practical reality of me trying to be a scholar and be a mother. I did take her because I wanted to take her, and she was willing to go. But the flip of that is that when you take your child to a cave site, you have to think about that cave site and your relationship to it a little bit differently. So one of the caves we have to army crawl into, and it started raining, and this cave actually becomes a kind of waterfall when it starts raining. So you have to army crawl in, and then the cave mouth is potentially covered with rain and a waterfall once you're in there. So I had to say things like, you need to go pee before we go into this cave, right? We need to have snacks so that you can eat. And that changes how you have to think about, like, oh, I'm a scholar, but I'm also a mother, right? I'm also having to kind of do double duty. But then watching her relate to these places made me ask different questions and pay attention to different things. That I wouldn't have asked those questions had she not been there with me. I wouldn't have thought the same things had she not been right there with me. And I'm going to have you slide forward. This is not an ancestral Cherokee site. This is more likely an ancestral Muskogee Creek site. This is further down in Alabama. There's a rock art site there that kind of spans basically a football field length of a side of a cliff. And it is multi-tiered, so there are layers of rock art that go up basically 3 stories. And there's a cave behind this cliff. You have to take a boat to get there, and then hike up. And when we hiked up that cliffside, there just happened to be some historic graffiti that, you know, my attention was kind of drawn to, but my daughter's with me. And etched in that graffiti was a girl had written her name and her age and the year. And it was almost exactly 100 years before we were there. And I thought to myself, a girl was here 100 years ago. Well, you know, there might have been a girl here 200 years ago, and there might have been a girl here 300 years ago, and there probably were girls here 1,000 years ago. This particular site is about, the art itself is about 800 years old. And so there's a way in which that had made me kind of think differently about these spaces and how to relate to them. How do you tell 800 years or 400 years of Cherokee history in a digestible way and in a way that is not 6 volumes long and that people want to read? And so we make choices as authors, and mine was to take a classroom and let a Cherokee girl guide us through that world. What would she learn? Who would she learn it from? Who was she teaching? Who was she being taught by? What was she interested in? What were her options educationally? And so I started with places that you all are probably familiar with. And so one of those places, and it's on the cover of my book, is Gadua. So the very first chapter is Gadua, which is a mother town to Cherokee people. That is my oldest site. And I think about that world through kind of a composite girl, because I don't have the records to have a girl from 400 years ago. So I created a kind of composite girl based on archaeology, based on oral narratives, based on thinking through the work of master artists today, people who are continuing the material work of basketry, of feather cape making, of creating fishing weirs, of all of the things that we know were present in those earlier moments, to help guide me to think about some of the ways we can know things about the earlier moment, even as we can't know everything. So one of the other places that kind of threw me was, this is kind of the confluence of where a lot of our cave sites are. So this corner area where, if any of you all know a little bit about Cherokees in the American Revolution, I mean, obviously this area is, Rutherford's Trace. We got to think about that moment, but also the Chickamauga warriors kind of moved further south in order to both fortify themselves, but also to align themselves with Muskogee Creeks in the American Revolution. They created a bunch of new towns, but a lot of those towns were older Muskogee Creek towns. This was a very briefly occupied period in Cherokee history for some of these towns. They were, if we think about the kind of longevity of a place like Gadua or Chota and Tanasi, these are very young and very briefly occupied Cherokee towns, because removal effectively ends a lot of the Cherokee presence in these towns. So this is a sense of where we are working at these cave sites. And obviously, Sequoia, the inventor of the syllabary, has to come into this story, right? I mean, that we don't have the syllabary on the wall of caves without having Sequoia. And of course, we don't know exact timelines for where Sequoia and exactly how long it took him. We know it was a long process. We know he had some trials things he tried that he then set aside because they weren't effective. We know that from the written records that we have available to us. But one of the things that we also know is that he was living around, after the lands that he lived on up in East Tennessee were lost through treaties, he moved further south to these newer Chickamauga towns, these lower towns, and he lived in and around Willstown. We have plenty of documents that tell us he's moving through that area. He's got a brother-in-law in Sauda. He's all around the area. He has a home site. He's certainly in that space. And, sorry, I'm having. So one of the ways that I wanted to think about this was also how we think about Sequoyah. Because I've always been, the story we get is that Sequoyah was a lone genius. And he was this brilliant man who separated himself out because he had to do this intense thinking. And so he squandered himself away, and he needed to just be a genius by himself. And that always seemed at odds for me as somebody who thinks about the role of community in Cherokee society. That and we know he got ostracized a little bit for some of this, but the idea that Sequoyah kind of sequestered himself away from his community always felt off to me. Added to that, the other piece of Sequoyah that felt off was that what does he do with the syllabary as soon as he creates it? He gives it back to Cherokee people. He immediately distributes it to the community. And that feels right in some ways, that he's not withholding education. He's not keeping intellectual, the intellectual work he's done from other Cherokee people. He's gifting it back to Cherokee people. And his whole process was about thinking about Cherokee speakers, that he devises this in relationship to Cherokee speakers, which is why it was so much more effective than perhaps what the missionaries were doing. So I wanted to kind of problematize Sequoyah in some ways that kind of put him back within an understanding of Cherokee culture, as opposed to this idea that I think American society has really wanted to take him and say, look, he's a lone male genius, and that's what lone male geniuses do. They pull themselves up by their bootstraps, and they bootstrap it by themselves. And I went, I even knew Thoreau was getting fed by his mama when he was out in the wilderness. That we know this kind of trope of the lone male genius is often problematized because other people are supporting those folks at a bare minimum. So the reality is, one of the people we know was in his orbit was his daughter Ayoka. So in the documentary record, Ayoka is the one who goes before the Cherokee National Council with him and demonstrates the efficacy of the syllabary to all of these naysayers. They send her away, Sequoyah writes her a note, they take that note from the council down to where Ayoka is, she reads it, she writes back to him, it goes back to him, and they verify that it in fact works. That story is out there. We know that about Ayoka. But one of the things that I said to myself, I'm going to go back and look at all of the primary documents, because I'm a historian. I look at primary documents. So I went back to the two earliest accounts describing Sequoyah's invention. And I put one of them up here for you all to see, because the other one is it's pretty darn close to this one. But I want to draw your attention to a couple things. Sequoyah's operating through an interpreter when he's visiting DC, and he's asked to describe how he creates the syllabary. What does he do? How did he do this? And he starts by saying, well, he paid attention to the voices of children and his companions. So the first thing we're told is that he listened to his community. But then if we go on, we learn that his own ear was not remarkably discriminating. And he called to his aid the more acute ears of his wife and children. He's suffering from hearing loss. He can't hear all of the sounds that he needs to hear when he's creating the syllabary. Okay? As somebody who had a grandfather with acute and severe hearing loss, who I only think probably heard a third what I said to him throughout my life, a mother who suffered from severe hearing loss my entire life, and as somebody who is now dealing with the realities of hearing loss, this struck me, and it also got me thinking that Ayoka isn't just learning from Sequoyah. She's his research assistant. And she's also there with him as he's engaged in this process. He hasn't isolated himself. He's very clearly telling us that his wife and children are with him when he's doing this work. And that is the reality of family life and Cherokee culture. So I thought to myself, well, what happens when we bring a yoka into the story, not just as a person who's the dutiful student to her father, but what happens when we stop and we say, a yoka was the first student of the syllabary. That added to that, she's there at its time of creation, and she's helping to create it. How does that change how we understand Sequoia in relationship to fatherhood? At a time when Cherokee fatherhood is changing rapidly because of outside pressures. And what a beautiful kind of way to bring your child in, to this moment of rapid change around fatherhood that could have been far more gendered, far more exclusive, and yet he invites his daughter into this process. And the story that we often get about his wife is that she burned early drafts of his syllabary and got in the way of his work. I think if he wasn't keeping up with his business, maybe she was right to do that. But, I'm also like, okay, but clearly she's also helping him at times. And so the story of her destruction isn't even a full picture of what she did. So I'm gonna have you. I wanted to rethink a yoka. She's been written about a lot by children's authors. They've kept her kind of legacy alive, but very often the way that she's remembered is as a student, a 6-year-old little girl, as a kind of very compliant child, learning from a teacher. And my mom was a public school teacher, I was a public school teacher. I get this. We want dutiful students. We want them to listen and do as they're told. But at the same time, what do we do when we have to think about a yoka in a bigger way? And also, a yoka her life didn't stop when she was 6. She grew up. She educated her own children. And added to that, one of the ways that we often have to think of and problematize a yoka and Sequoia is that Sequoia very often gets wrapped up with forced removal, with the Trail of Tears. But Sequoia wasn't subjected to this Trail of Tears. He was an old settler. He left earlier. And obviously, I think there's still a story of coercion there. We still have to talk about the pressures that Cherokee people were under when old settlers were making that decision. But the ways we've remembered Sequoia is that somehow he's wrapped up at the Trail of Tears. And yet, his lived experience was one of leaving sooner. Now, as a Cherokee Nation citizen, this is important for a variety of